The billionaire was known everywhere for his strong personality, big heart, and endless money. He had built his company from the ground up, starting with nothing but a single small office and a stubborn dream. Over the years, he became one of the most powerful men in the country. People looked at him and thought he was unshakable, as if nothing could ever bring him down. But life has a strange way of humbling even the strongest people. One quiet evening, during a family dinner, his hands started to tremble. He felt dizzy and tried to stand, but his legs gave up. His family rushed to him as he collapsed in his own home, surrounded by the people who loved him most. The family did not wait a second. An ambulance was called immediately. Within minutes, the grand hall of his mansion turned into a place of panic. Uniformed medics arrived with machines, stretchers, and masks. The flashing red lights outside the gate caught the attention of the entire neighborhood. The billionaire's family followed the ambulance to the hospital, their hearts pounding. No one had ever seen him weak before, not even for a single day. But now, lying on the stretcher with his eyes half open, he looked fragile. His breath was uneven. His skin had turned pale, and a silence filled the room that no one dared to break. Because of his status and wealth, the best doctors were called in immediately. One after another, top specialists arrived, experts in heart, brain, lungs, and every field imaginable. They surrounded his bed like soldiers preparing for a war they didn't fully understand. They ran tests, checked his heart, his blood, his lungs. Machines beeped rhythmically, their cold sounds mixing with the quiet sobs of his family. Every nurse in the hospital moved quickly, carrying files and medicines. It felt like the entire hospital had frozen around one man. His eldest son, a quiet and serious man, stood near the door. He kept asking questions, trying to understand what was happening, but the answers were always the same. "We're trying. We're not sure yet. We need more tests." Each reply felt heavier than the last. Hours passed, and the doctors started looking worried. The billionaire's condition was not improving. The medicine didn't seem to work. His breathing remained shallow. Sweat covered his forehead, and even though the room was warm, he looked cold. The family members began to whisper to one another, asking what would happen if nothing worked. No one dared to finish the sentence. Back at the mansion, everything was in chaos. The household staff, who had always seen their boss as strong and unstoppable, were standing in small groups whispering in fear. Among them was the maid, a woman who had worked in the house for years. She was quiet, polite, and hardworking. She rarely spoke unless spoken to. Many people didn't even notice her most of the time, yet she saw everything. She had watched the children grow up, she had prepared food on rainy nights, and she had been there through their happiest and saddest days. When the ambulance had taken him away, she stood frozen in the hallway. She didn't have fancy clothes or expensive education, but she had a kind heart and a sharp memory. She remembered something from her village many years ago, a story about a man who fell sick in the same way. She wasn't sure why the thought came to her then, but it refused to leave her mind. She went to the kitchen, sat on a small stool, and pressed her hands together nervously. She wanted to help, but how could a maid help when 20 of the best doctors were already working to save him? At the hospital, the night grew heavier. The billionaire lay still on the bed. The doctors moved in and out like a wave, trying everything they knew. Some of them had flown in from other cities. Their faces were tight, their hands tired, but nothing changed. The machines kept making the same cold sound. The billionaire's daughter held her father's hand and whispered softly, as if her words could bring him back. But his eyelids barely moved. The doctors had tried so much, but he seemed to be slipping away with every passing hour. In the corner of the hospital waiting room, the maid sat quietly. She had followed the family not because anyone asked her to, but because she felt something deep inside her. A pull she couldn't explain. She kept her small cloth bag on her lap. Inside it was something she always carried, a simple pouch with a mix of dried herbs and oils that her grandmother had taught her about. It wasn't magic, it wasn't expensive. It was something old, something from the days when hospitals were far away and people depended on nature. The doctors started talking among themselves in low voices. Words like critical, complications, and unresponsive filled the air. The billionaire's eldest son stared at the floor with clenched fists. The youngest daughter wept softly into her hands. Every passing minute felt longer than an hour. It was the kind of night that changes people forever. And in the middle of all this noise and fear, the maid kept remembering that story from her childhood. The smell of those same herbs, the old man who had recovered when everyone had thought it was the end. She took a deep breath and tightened her fingers around the little pouch in her lap. She didn't know what the night would bring. She didn't know if anyone would even listen to her. But something told her this wasn't over yet. By the time the clock on the wall passed midnight, 20 doctors had already tried everything they could. One by one, they stepped out of the room exhausted and quiet. The family sat with red eyes and tired faces. The house staff, including the maid, stood outside, their hearts sinking. It was a moment of stillness, the kind that makes people believe hope is gone. But deep inside the maid's chest, there was still a small spark. She didn't know it yet, but her quiet steps were about to lead to something no one in that house would ever forget. The night felt endless. The air inside the hospital was heavy, almost too quiet. Only the soft beeping of machines filled the room. The billionaire lay there, weak and pale, surrounded by tubes and wires. His breathing was slow, his hands cold. The doctors who had worked for hours finally stepped outside to speak with the family. Their shoulders were slouched, their eyes tired, and their faces carried the quiet weight of helplessness. No one wanted to say it out loud, but everyone understood what their silence meant. The billionaire's eldest son sat with his head in his hands. His youngest daughter, who had always believed her father was stronger than anything, was holding onto his arm, begging him to open his eyes. Friends and business partners were standing quietly near the doorway, their expensive suits unable to hide their fear. For the first time, money had no power here. All the wealth in the world couldn't stop the ticking of the clock, and in the far corner the maid sat alone. She was wearing her simple uniform, her hands tightly wrapped around the small pouch she carried everywhere. Her heart was beating fast. She was not a doctor. She had no special training. She was just a maid who had once learned an old family remedy from her grandmother in a small village far away. But something deep inside told her she couldn't just sit there and watch him slip away. She had served this family for years. She had seen their joys and sorrows. She had cleaned the floors while he walked through the house giving instructions in his strong voice. She had prepared tea for guests, arranged flowers, and comforted crying children when no one else was around. To her, he was not just a boss. He was someone she respected deeply. She stood up slowly and walked closer to the door of his room. No one noticed her at first. Everyone was too lost in their own thoughts. Her steps were soft, almost unsure, but there was a quiet strength in the way she held herself. She peered through the small opening of the door and saw him lying there helpless, the man who once commanded boardrooms and made impossible things happen. Now he could not even lift his hand. The memory of that day in her village grew stronger in her mind. She remembered an old man who had fallen sick in the same way. The doctors were far away and the villagers had no hope, but her grandmother had used a traditional remedy, something passed down through generations. It was a mix of natural herbs and warm oils that helped restore breathing and calm the body. She had watched it with her own eyes as a little girl. She didn't know if it would work here, but something whispered to her, at least try. The eldest son noticed her standing near the door. His eyes were red and tired.
"What are you doing here?"
he asked softly, his voice weak. She lowered her head respectfully and spoke quietly, almost like she was afraid of her own words. She explained that she had seen something like this before and asked if she could try. At first, the room fell silent. Some people stared at her as if they didn't understand what she was talking about. One of the family friends frowned. A few shook their heads. "She's just the maid," someone whispered. But the billionaire's daughter, the one who had grown up seeing this woman care for them like family, stepped forward. Her eyes were wet but steady. "Let her," she said softly. "We've tried everything else." Those words hung in the air like a small flame in a dark room. After a long, painful pause, the eldest son gave a small nod. It wasn't a loud yes. It wasn't a promise. But it was enough. The maid took a deep breath, walked inside the room, and gently closed the door behind her. She didn't rush. She moved slowly, carefully, as if she were walking on glass. She placed the small pouch on the bedside table, opened it, and the smell of dried herbs filled the air. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't expensive. It was something pure and simple. She mixed the herbs with warm oil that one of the nurses handed her without asking too many questions. She rubbed the mixture between her palms to warm it up. Then, with gentle hands, she placed it on the billionaire's chest and forehead. She whispered softly. Not magic words, not prayers from a book, just the words her grandmother had used long ago, meant to calm a struggling heart. She massaged his chest slowly, pressing carefully near his ribs to help his breathing. Everyone outside waited in silence, holding their breath. For a long moment, nothing happened. The machines kept beeping the same way. The family stood frozen in the hallway. But then one of the nurses looked at the monitor and blinked in surprise. The heart rate, which had been dangerously low, had begun to rise, just a little at first, then a bit more. His breathing grew deeper. His fingers twitched. The maid didn't stop. She kept her hands on his chest, steady and calm. A doctor who was standing nearby rushed in to check the monitors. His voice was low but firm as he told the others to watch. Slowly, the billionaire's skin started to regain its color. His lips, which had been pale, became warm again. The nurse whispered, "His breathing is stabilizing." One of the doctors leaned closer to check his pulse and looked completely stunned. The machines, which had been flat and dull, now showed life returning. The maid didn't lift her hands. She continued the old steps exactly as she had learned years ago. It wasn't about science to her. It was about care, patience, and love. The billionaire's eyes fluttered for the first time in hours. His daughter gasped. The eldest son moved forward, not daring to believe what he was seeing. The doctors exchanged looks, confused, amazed, but also relieved. Within minutes, the room that had felt like a place of quiet sorrow turned into a place of hope. The maid finally stepped back, her hands trembling slightly. She wasn't sure if what she had done would last, but in that moment, something had changed. The man everyone thought would not make it through the night had just taken the deepest breath of his life. The nurse gently called out the numbers from the monitor. The doctors gathered, checking everything again and again as if they needed to make sure it wasn't a mistake. But it wasn't. The maid lowered her eyes humbly and stepped back to the corner of the room, her heart beating fast. She didn't expect praise. She didn't expect thanks. All she had wanted was to help, and she had. Outside the room, whispers filled the hallway. People couldn't believe it. The same doctors who had spent hours trying everything now stood there with eyes wide in surprise. The billionaire's family looked through the glass with hope they hadn't felt all night. Something extraordinary had just happened. Not by machines, not by technology, but by the hands of a quiet maid who believed in something simple and pure. And everyone who witnessed it knew they would never forget that moment. The sun began to rise slowly, and a soft golden light spilled into the hospital hallway. The night had been long, dark, and full of fear, but the morning carried something different. Hope. The billionaire, who just hours ago was lying still and cold, now sat up weakly on his bed. His eyes were open. His breathing was calm. The color had returned to his face. It was as if the man who everyone thought might not make it through the night had simply decided to come back. The doctors had gathered around his bed, checking every number on the machines, every sign on his body. They looked puzzled but also deeply relieved. No one could explain exactly how his body had turned around so quickly. All their expensive treatments and countless hours of trying had not worked. Yet a quiet maid with a simple remedy had done what 20 of the best doctors in the country could not. His eldest son stood by his bedside, still holding onto the edge of the bed as if afraid to let go. The youngest daughter sat beside him, her eyes full of tears, not of sadness now, but of joy. She kept whispering to him, "Dad, you're okay. You're really okay." The billionaire looked around the room slowly, as if trying to understand everything that had happened. He saw the worried faces that had watched over him, the nurses, the doctors, his family. And then his eyes stopped on her. The maid was standing quietly in the corner of the room. She hadn't moved much since the night before. Her hands were folded, her eyes lowered. She didn't look for attention. She didn't expect applause. She had only wanted to help. When his eyes met hers, something in the room shifted. It was silent but powerful. He raised his weak hand slightly, a small, slow movement that still carried strength. His daughter noticed and turned to the maid. "Come closer," she said softly. The maid walked slowly to the side of the bed, unsure of what to say or do. She had worked for this family for years, cooking meals, cleaning rooms, and staying in the background. She had never imagined that one day she would be standing here, with everyone's eyes on her after doing something no one expected. The billionaire tried to speak. His voice was hoarse, soft, but clear. "Thank you," he whispered. Just 2 words. But they carried more weight than any speech he had ever given in boardrooms. The eldest son turned to the doctors. "You all saw what happened," he said in a quiet but firm voice. They nodded. Some still looked confused. One of the doctors stepped forward. "We can't fully explain it medically," he admitted honestly. "But something she did, it worked. His vitals improved almost instantly. It's like his body responded to it when nothing else did." For the first time, the maid realized that everyone was truly seeing her. Not as just a maid, not as someone in the background, but as the person who helped save a man everyone had thought was slipping away. Outside the hospital, news had already begun to spread. People who had gathered in front of the building the night before in fear were now whispering about the miracle. Some of the staff from the mansion came rushing in, their faces lighting up when they saw him sitting upright. The nurses exchanged smiles with one another. Even the doctors, who were known for their serious expressions, could not hide their relief. The billionaire asked to be left alone with his family and the maid for a few minutes. Everyone stepped out quietly. He looked at his children. "I owe her my life," he said softly. "Not the machines, not the money, her." His daughter held the maid's hand and squeezed it gently. The maid's eyes filled with tears. She had never been praised like this in her life. She didn't do it for a reward. She had done it because her heart told her to help. A few days later, the billionaire was discharged from the hospital. Reporters waited outside, cameras flashing, microphones pointed. People expected to hear about the brilliant doctors or a new treatment. But when the billionaire spoke to the press, he surprised everyone. "The person who saved my life," he said slowly, "was not a doctor. It was someone people usually don't see. Someone humble. Someone with a kind heart." He turned slightly and gestured toward the maid standing behind him in her simple clothes. The crowd gasped softly. For the first time in her life, she stood in front of cameras, but she didn't speak. She lowered her eyes, shy and overwhelmed. The billionaire continued. "Money can buy many things, but sometimes the answer comes from where you least expect it. This woman saved me with her hands and her courage." That single statement spread everywhere, on news channels, social media, and newspapers. People began to talk about the maid, about her courage and the old knowledge she carried from her village. Back at the mansion, everything changed. The maid was no longer just the quiet woman in the background. The family now treated her with deep respect. She was given a proper place at the table during meals, something that had never happened before. The children hugged her, the staff looked at her with pride, and the billionaire himself would often sit with her just to talk and listen to her stories. It wasn't about the money. It was about gratitude. It was about recognizing a good heart. The doctors who had been part of the long night came back to visit him weeks later. Even they admitted that what happened that night had taught them something they could never learn in medical school. That healing isn't only in science, sometimes it is also in care, faith, and human touch. The maid returned to her duties, but her life was never the same. People respected her now. The family gave her the choice to retire with a generous gift, but she decided to stay. "This house is like my family," she said softly. And they accepted her words with warmth. Every year after that night, on the same date, the billionaire gathered everyone who had been there and told the story again. Not to boast, but to remind everyone to never underestimate the quiet ones, the ones who stand in the corner with humble hearts. The night when 20 doctors failed, but a simple woman stepped forward, became a story that spread far beyond their home. It wasn't about power or wealth anymore. It was about kindness, courage, and the simple touch of a woman who believed she could help. And in that story, she was no longer just a maid. She became a symbol of hope. Even years later, when people spoke about that night, they didn't just talk about the billionaire. They spoke about her. The woman who reminded the world that miracles don't always wear white coats or cost millions. Sometimes they come with quiet steps, gentle hands, and a heart full of love.